Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Trini Casey Myatt, and I am the Regional Director with Robert Half Talent Solutions for Alberta. Thank you for joining our important discussion today. I am thrilled to be hosting this event in partnership with Inclusion Alberta, an incredible organization that has been supporting children and adults with developmental disabilities, along with their families, for over 60 years. This is a topic that is near and dear to me, as I have a nephew who has an intellectual disability, and I started my career helping individuals with intellectual and physical disabilities, providing meaningful employment services. So today we're going to be exploring disability inclusion in the workplace to better understand the reality of a more than 70% unemployment rate for these individuals, and the positive impact a more accessible, inclusive hiring and retention strategy can have within an organization. Before we begin, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. We will be recording today's webinar, and it will be available for on-demand viewing. A follow-up email with the link to the recording will be shared post-event. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion, so please enter your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Today we are joined by Wendy McDonald, Chief Operating Officer for Inclusion Alberta, and Alfredo Mendez, VP of Employee Experience and Inclusion at Robert Half. I'd like to begin by turning it over to the two of you for a brief self-introduction around what you do, how you got involved in the disability and inclusion space. And so Wendy, I'm going to send it over to you first.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining and for the opportunity to spend some time talking about this really important topic. So as you know, my name is Wendy. Inclusion Alberta is a nonprofit organization. We're 65 years old that support the interests of individuals with developmental disabilities and their families. We were formed 65 years ago by a small group of parents who dreamed of a better life for their family members with developmental disabilities. And today, 65 years later, we remain the same. We're a family-governed organization that supports the interests of individuals with developmental disabilities to live an inclusive life, one that's actually the same as yours and mine. And so we work to remove the barriers that typical normal life that you and I experience have. And today, of course, we're going to focus on a huge barrier for this population, that's employment. So I got involved in this space first as a mom. I have two boys. My eldest is a CA by designation who lives with his wife and two daughters in the Cayman Islands. And my youngest son, Kyle, has a developmental disability and an impairment, and a visual impairment, sorry. Before Kyle was in grade 1, I began to learn what the realities were for individuals with developmental disabilities, not only in Alberta, but across the country. Today, in 2022, this population sits with a close to 80% unemployment rate. And I'd like to think that, have you think about that just for a moment. When things were shutting down with COVID, we hit in some parts of this country a 15 to 18% unemployment rate, and people were horrified. I guess I often wonder why we aren't horrified about an 80% unemployment rate for people in our community. So I learned that if you have a developmental disability, you're destined for a life of poverty, marginalization, government assistance, isolation, and loneliness. And as a mom, this devastated me because the hopes and dreams I have for both of my boys are exactly the same. My background is in HR, and as an HR professional, I was embarrassed that I had not ever hired somebody with a developmental disability, or quite frankly, even considered it. So although my initial connection to this space is as a mom, I've spent the last 22 years working with organizations on the inclusion of individuals with developmental disabilities in the workforce. This is a population that want to work and can have a positive impact on the bottom line in any company that they work for.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and we're very thrilled to have you with us today. Alf, we'll kick it over to you.
Perfect. Well, hello, everybody. It's an honor and a privilege to be with all of you today. My name is Alfredo Mendez, and I'm the Vice President of Experience and Inclusion at Robert Half. I've been in this role now for a little over a year, but have spent my career in the talent development, organization effectiveness, and DEI space as well. The idea of inclusion and creating a culture of belonging is something that is incredibly near and dear to my heart. I am a first generation Mexican American. My parents both immigrated to the United States when they were teenagers. I'm the first one in my family to go to college. I'm also a gay male and have also been surrounded by family members with developmental disabilities as well. And so the intention of what it is that we are trying to create at Robert Half, and by extension, what we're looking to be able to create around the world, is this idea of belonging. Whereas we look at all of the various dimensions of diversity, whether it be race and ethnicity, whether it be disability, whether it be something as simple as, did you grow up in a large city or in a small rural town? All of these dimensions bring difference into the organization and bring a different perspective and a different diversity of thought. And we should really be celebrating those differences and incorporating those differences accordingly, so that each and every one of us feels like we have the ability to bring our authentic selves to work and to really be able to have the same opportunities to succeed, to grow, and to thrive our careers accordingly. So I'm excited to be here, and I look forward to the conversation and sharing some findings and some learnings along the way.
Thanks, Alf. Happy to have you with us. Well, let's kick it off, and let's really first start by defining, what do we mean by disability? And so, Wendy, I'll pass it over to you. What are the realities for this population, and what challenges do they face?
Sure. So for the organization that I work with, we support specifically individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities. You will hear that term either or, depending on where you sit geographically. The difference is primarily in Eastern Canada and the US, the language of intellectual disability is used, and in Western Canada, it's typically developmental disability. But just to be clear, we're talking about the same population. Someone with a developmental disability is a person who lives with a below average cognitive ability. Some examples are individuals who live with Down syndrome or Williams syndrome or autism. Just to be careful though, not everybody who has an autism diagnosis has a cognitive disability. Or it could be someone like my son who doesn't have a label other than he's a person who has a developmental disability. One of the biggest reasons this population sits with this horrendous unemployment rate is simply access to the labor market. So the typical HR practices and policies that work for 99% of the employees you hire are going to eliminate this population immediately. If organizations truly want to be inclusive, and what I really appreciate so much about Robert Half having this webinar today is there is a lot of conversation about diversity, inclusion, and equity. But honestly, many times when I'm in conversations with organizations, even in that conversation, they're not including this population. They're not including people with developmental or intellectual disabilities. So specifically for this group, what we need, and one of the biggest barriers, is actually a pathway into organizations. And I like to use the term an intentional pathway in, because those practices that are in place for the majority of people you hire don't need to change, shouldn't change. What we look at is, how do we access, how does this population access an organization? And sometimes it takes just really a different pathway in, a little bit of modification to the pathway in. And I guess one of the other barriers, and I'm speaking again specific to this population, is if individuals with developmental disabilities were competing for a role against somebody who doesn't have a developmental disability, the likelihood of them kind of winning that race is honestly zero. So we look for a pathway in and an ability for individuals with developmental disabilities to compete in the same way that, you know, the rest of your employees would compete for a role.
Thank you, Wendy. And certainly, you know, even thinking about that barrier to applying for roles and whatnot, just makes you think about it a little bit differently. So thank you for that. We all know that it's a great idea in theory, and most support the inclusion of those with a disability in their hiring processes. But Alpha, I'll send this over to you. Why is it important for companies to prioritize disability hiring and inclusion?
I think Wendy alluded to this as part of her opening remarks and a little bit about this intentionality around really thinking about how we go after this population and how we include them into our overall hiring process and our people development processes as well. I think the reality of it is, you know, to Wendy's point, we do focus on hiring and the advancement of racial minorities, of gender. Those tend to be the traditional categories that we tend to focus on. But if you think back to kind of one of the things that I said at the beginning in my introduction around creating this culture of belonging, we need to be able to expand the definition of what diversity means and to look across it from a variety of dimensions. One of the interesting components in the disability space, and it was actually part of our conversations as we prepared to share this information with all of you today, is companies tend to focus more on the physical disability side of the house because there tends to be a lot more regulation, regulatory requirements, things of that sort as well, that enables companies to play a little bit more in that space. But the idea of the developmental or the intellectual disability is another component that needs to be a prevalent part in order for us to really have that diversity of thought that we're seeking in the organization. We recognize that people that bring in this perspective are going to have a different approach to the way that they work, are going to have different challenges and different things that they're going to require, but they're also going to be providing different perspectives and point of views to help round out the way that we're thinking and to give us a perspective that is relatively new in the workplace. And so, while we can continue the efforts in the traditional diverse dimensions that we've gone after historically, we're going to continue to see a lot of the same patterns and a lot of the same findings because we're not intentional in bringing in these employees or these participants that bring in a very different perspective. And so in order to get to that place of belonging, in order to create that authenticity that we're looking to bring, we do have to create that sense of intentionality, and we do have to find the right partners to guide us down the process, because we recognize that it is different to onboard or to integrate someone with a developmental or intellectual disability than it is a female employee or someone that comes from a racial minority background as well. And so having the opportunity to not only think about what are the opportunities that we have as we integrate them in, but what are the challenges that we're going to have to go through and how do we incorporate and update our processes accordingly, that really needs to be the end state that we're trying to get to in order to create that sense of belonging, if that's our true objective.
Mm-hmm. It's so much to unpack there, Alf, for sure. And I think the whole movement for diversity is just to gain those different perspectives and to be better and be stronger. And it's unfortunately such an underrepresented group. And so the intentionality absolutely without question has to be there. And so often we don't change because there is a fear or lack of knowledge on how to change. And so Wendy, I'm going to send this one over to you. Can you describe where you most often see the major gaps or misunderstandings in terms of hiring disabled individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to speak to Alf's point, I just want to say that sometimes it takes a bit of different work, but it's not harder or it's not more complicated. And I see that as one of the gaps is organizations get worried about, how much they're taking on by doing this. And that's a bit of a myth. This doesn't actually have to be any it may be a little different in how you're doing things, but it's not more, it's not harder. So I would say that is one thing that we hear from employers repeatedly, is they've made it, anticipated this to be like harder or more complicated than it needs to be. So the other, misunderstandings, and I would say a little myth busting that we talk about all the time, is one of the barriers we often hear is safety. Is what about safety for this population? And what's really interesting is when you do the research, individuals with disabilities have far greater safety records than their non-disabled colleagues. So, we need to kind of really look at the facts of hiring versus, I think, what maybe we think we know about a certain population. I think another is this idea that, I've just touched on, that people need a lot of additional time and support. And yes, individuals with developmental disabilities, particularly at the beginning of a job, will need some additional support. And again, Alf talked about partnering. I think having a partner is really critical in this work. And for us at Inclusion Alberta, we take that responsibility on. Any additional support needs are handled by the partner. We don't interfere with the employer-employee relationship, but we're there to provide, any additional support for either the individual. But really, honestly, when I started this work 22 years ago, I thought our support was really around the person with the disability. And not that that's not true, but I'll tell you, our work is really around supporting employers far more than it is around the individuals that we support. And I'm, going to be really honest, I think attitude remains a gap. I think employers are sometimes don't understand that this is a population that can contribute, want to contribute, have lots to contribute. For example, I'll use Alberta, just as one example. We have now 21 of the 26 post-secondary institutions in this province that offer inclusive post-secondary education to adults with developmental disability. These are individuals that want careers in the same way that, any of us who went to university or college wanted, and literally just need to be given an opportunity to show themselves.
Well, that is fantastic to hear. 21 out of 26 is that's a great number, and definitely some interesting facts there. And so often it's just that misunderstanding that gets in the way. And so, Alf, I'll go to you. What process does a company need to have in place to ensure that individuals with disabilities feel welcomed, and how can a company create a work culture where those with accessibility needs feels a sense of belonging? And then maybe if you can add in, what is Robert Half doing in this area?
Well, we definitely are excited to continue to pave the way in this particular respect. And I think there's something that Wendy has said that I think is really important to just kind of double down on a little bit, which is this idea of different doesn't have to be more complicated. Different isn't bad, it's just different. And I think we need to be going into this work with this mantra of different isn't bad, it's just different. And so when we look at our processes and we look at how do we attract talent? How do we bring them through the hiring process? How do we eventually develop and grow their careers? We need to ensure that those processes themselves don't have any barriers to entry or any significant roadblocks that it just makes it difficult for that person coming in to just automatically not be successful in that particular process. And so it does give us the necessity to think about, should we be leveraging different external partners to promote our jobs to this particular population? Do we need to make modifications to our hiring process? Perhaps We may find that individuals with intellectual disabilities prefer more one-on-one conversations versus panel interviews. So how do we modify that particular process to ensure that we're giving them a fair shot of being able to express their skills and introduce themselves to us, while at the same time learning about us and figuring out the type of environment that they're going to potentially be walking into? And these are the types of things that we've started to really look at from a Robert Half perspective, is really looking at the culture component. Because once you think about the process and you simplify the points of entry for people from these populations, then it's about keeping them here. And it's about creating that sense of retention in order for them to feel like they truly belong within the organization. And so from a Robert Half perspective, we've started entering in partnerships with, at the global level, with Disability In, which is a large global organization that is focused on physical and developmental disabilities, and gives us not only the ability to tap into talent pipelines to be able to bring in particular employees, but it also gives us knowledge, resources, and education that we can roll out to our employees, to our hiring managers, to help them understand the nuances and the differences of what it means to welcome that community as part of the overall culture as well. The internal education piece is another critical component of it. And, a lot of us here are probably, we hear the word training and we probably think of compliance training, and that, here comes someone with the, waving a stick at you saying, you got to get that training done. But it really is more about how do we involve this as part of the day-to-day job. If you're a hiring manager, you shouldn't have to attend a separate training session to tick the box, but how do we weave that in to the way that you manage your team, to the way that you think about going and getting additional talent? How do we find those integrative opportunities so that it feels like part of your job and not an add-on to the job? That becomes a critical component of this. And then it's about building community with people that share these demographics and share this community, or share a sense of connection to the community. So whether that's through the development of an employee network group, at Robert Half, we've had a few employees from a disability perspective that have wanted to form an affinity group where they want to bring a community of people that look like them, that think like them, that go through some of these same issues, to have a shared perspective and to be able to build that sense of community, and then eventually open it up to allies as well, so that we can really think about what are the longer term changes that we want to be able to make accordingly. And so again, pulling all of these various levers becomes really important. But again, we have to be unafraid to be able to actually move in this space. And we need to have the courage of our conviction to say, if our end game is belonging and we want to create this culture of inclusion, then we've got to pull all of these levers. And someone's eventually got to go first and try something new. But that's the beauty of this work as well, is the intentionality of finding the right partners, of bringing in that perspective, and of having the courage to move into this space. That's what ultimately is going to create that perfect ecosystem for these folks to thrive and to really be, to make that 80% statistic something of the past as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add a thought?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
absolutely.
What's really interesting to me in this work is, Alf, you talked about culture, right? The culture of an organization. And so I have two kind of thoughts is, anecdotally, literally every day, we hear from employers who talk about the benefits of hiring people with developmental disabilities and the positive impact on culture.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes again, we create things. I don't want to say we overthink it. I think we should think about these things. I'm not implying we shouldn't. But literally by adding diversity to an organization has a positive impact on culture. And so you want to impact the culture of your organization, try doing this, because it has, a really profound effect. One recent example was a company, they're a large insurance broker. They hired a young man, and we have a practice in our work that when somebody's hired, we'll go in and meet with the team without the person there, and we do something that's called a staff address, just to allow colleagues to ask questions in a safe place. You know, we can provide a little bit of information. Anyway, they hire this young man, and the CEO was away in the States on a business trip. And when this announcement came, his phone was like, you know, blowing up, and he thought, oh my goodness. And it was employee after employee texting him and emailing him and saying, this is the kind of organization I want to work for. This makes me proud to be part of this company. So I just want to say the unintended benefits of hiring and being really thoughtful about inclusion and diversity. We can do a lot of stuff internally, right, to make sure it's a welcoming environment for everybody. But just the action of hiring will actually have an impact on that culture.
Wendy, anything, if I could add on one more thing to that. I mean, I think we all know, as it's those of us in the DEI space as practitioners, right? We know, we've seen all of the studies around how diverse teams, by definition, just do everything better. They're more profitable, they solve better problems, they're more innovative. The data tells us that consistently time and time again. And so this notion that you bring up of, just taking the action and actually just bringing on the people does really, it creates a very large, something to get behind and something for employees to get excited about. Our subsidiary Protivity is in the process of building a shared service center in the Ohio region of the US. And we are being very intentional at working with organizations that can provide talent from an intellectual and developmental disability perspective to be part of that shared service center as well. And so that is our entry point, to be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional on how do we create a more steady pipeline. But the initial buzz that we're getting on our end from our employees is exactly what you just described. This is fantastic. It aligns to our core values. It's indicative of the type of company that we want to work for. And it's interesting because I go back to something that you said at the very beginning about, would we be shocked if we saw these numbers in context of other things as well? And so, as companies, we don't necessarily, loudly celebrate or get excited about when we hire, folks from racial minorities, or when we hire females. It's great, right? But for whatever reason with this population, we think, yeah, fantastic, like this is great work. It should just be part of the natural way of going to get the talent, right? And that is the big hurdle that we all need to cross as practitioners, is really thinking about just how do we make this just be part of the status quo and have this just be a natural channel for us to attract and retain this talent appropriately, so that it isn't a cause for celebration, it's a cause for excitement, because it's adding to our culture and it's just continuing to make us a great place to work as well.
Yeah, the other little add-on I'll say is we hear again repeatedly about leaders who talk about how they become better leaders, better communication styles, and the strategies to include somebody with a developmental disability work for everybody on the team. And so, again, if we put too much focus on the challenge of, what do I need to know and think about, I just want to reinforce what Alpha said, is I think this is an opportunity for organizations to partner, that we don't, or at least I'll speak from our organization, we don't actually expect organizations to hold this knowledge. You do have partners in your community who are really interested in working with you to figure this out. So don't let having to know it all be a barrier to the inclusion of people with disabilities in your organizations.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly what Alf touched on in terms of what Robert Half is doing, and we've been very intentional and very communicative about it. And in my 18 years with Robert Half, I would say it's probably the one thing that I hear the most about from our employees, of how proud they are that we're leading the way in so many ways. And so I think you're spot on, Wendy, in that the impact that it has on the culture it's hard to duplicate. So And Wendy, you kind of segued into our next piece that, you know, the barrier for companies in creating the right processes and getting started and embracing people with disabilities in the workplace is identifying who can help them. And so who can companies turn to and partner with for help in setting up the successful processes that go beyond the typical hiring practices? And then what are some of the recommendations that might be provided to ensure that employers have the information and the knowledge necessary to properly support those with the developmental disabilities?
Yeah, so you're right. I probably have hinted, if not answered this, is find a partner. So if you are in Canada, for example, there is a provincial association like Inclusion Alberta in every province and territory. In the States, I mean, there's you've already mentioned, Alf, the partnership that Robert Half has. But there are a lot of organizations who would be interested in partnering with, and you know, any employer who is interested in having the conversation. So if you're in Canada and would like to understand who a partner might be, if you're not in Alberta, if you're in Alberta, call me, and we're interested. But if you're in other parts of the country, we have a sister provincial or territorial organization in every province. And federally, there's an initiative called Ready, Willing, and Able that is to increase the employment rates for people with developmental disabilities and autism spectrum disorder. So I have a link to that group as well. I guess though the really kind of simple answer is, I want to say to employers, don't do this alone. Just like you reach out to lawyers for legal advice, or accountants for accountant advice, or IT professionals for IT advice, work with a partner in your community. And from Inclusion Alberta's perspective, and I know that you know this, Trina, we use the word partner really seriously. We see ourselves as a partner with an organization and work with any organization who would like to learn more. And I think sometimes where organizations get stuck is they're interested in hiring, but they don't know how. The partner is there to help with the how. And that could be, I don't even know if there's a potential role in this organization for somebody of this population. And that's a really okay question to ask. And as a partner, we would come in and have that conversation, do some exploring, and we're going to be honest. If we don't think there is, one of our ethics is this is around real work for real pay, and it's not around charity. This is around individuals who can make a contribution and a positive impact on the bottom line. And so we're going to work with organizations to determine if there is a potential role. I have to tell you, there literally almost always is, but that's an okay question. And you don't have to do the development of the job description on your own. We'll help you figure that out. And so sometimes there's a job description in place, but there's a piece of that job description that would be a little too complicated for somebody that we support. So we might modify that job description a bit in partnership with the employer to pull that out. But I guess really the short answer is, you have allies and community partners wherever you are that would really be interested in working with, any organization on figuring this out. So if there's an interest and you don't know how, that's okay. Reach out.
Well, you make it sound like you partner to make it very easy, Wendy. So I love that. And I think that that's fantastic. And so, many organizations already have some programs in place to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, Alpha, I'm going to throw this one over to you. How can internal programs be modified for greater accessibility?
Well, I think we all have to really look at ourselves under the lens of inclusion equals belonging, right? And so if we know that that's the end game that we're trying to get to, it gives us a North Star and a vantage point to really be able to look at these programs, to really think about, are they being as inclusive as they can be? So, earlier we talked about the hiring process and, do we have adaptability and accommodations for different interview formats or for different interview styles or for different types of questions to help highlight skills as we look at members of the community with intellectual disability. When we bring people on to, into our organizations, how do we communicate with them? Do we have the right mechanisms in place? Are we ensuring that we are not bombarding them with too much information? Do we ensure that our communications channels have the right levels of accessibility that have, for some folks that might require a bit more information or things of that sort, do we create the resources and the materials necessary for them to be able to absorb the information that they need accordingly? And, the reality of it is when we start thinking about retention and growth programs, if I have an employee who has an intellectual disability and, we have a job description and the skills and responsibilities that we are looking to, for that person to bring to the table, as we think about our performance process, right, we're looking at the performance against the work, right? We're looking at whether that person is actually bringing those skills. So that process should not be any different than the way that we measure and reward any of our other employees as well. But it does get us to beg the question around, in a world, we see this a lot on the race side of the house, in a world where, say, 10% of your population might be employees from the Black African American community. If you start to analyze the data and you see they only make up 10% of the population, but for some reason they're 50% of the lowest rated employees in the organization, there's a fundamental disconnect there, right? That's where the issue of bias starts to come into play. And so that's the other piece that we really need to think about with our programs and our processes is how are we ensuring, A, that we're checking for bias, and B, that we're removing it or eliminating it where possible. And so especially as we open a new talent pipeline to bring in employees with intellectual disabilities, the last thing that we want to do is for them to feel like they have to exit or for us to push them out because of our biases or because we just don't really understand how they fit into the process or how the process is designed to include them as well. And so that's another prevalent piece that is more difficult said than done, right? Because I think there's obviously the belief that, we all know that we carry bias, but not all of us acknowledge that we carry bias. And so that is a very tricky situation to navigate. But the more that we talk about it, the more that we're intentional about it, the more that we're really looking at whether that bias is even prevalent or whether it exists, that's going to be the opportunity for us to really determine whether we've created processes that are causing chaos or whether the processes are actually fit for purpose and are going to be adaptable for everybody to really be able to succeed and to have that sense of belonging that we're going after as well.
Thanks, Alf. I think there's so many things that can be done and like as you have touched on already, it doesn't have to be so difficult. It's just a little bit different. And I think with the intention there, we can definitely make a difference. And so, thank you both to Alf and Wendy for this incredibly insightful conversation. I wish we had all day. I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but yeah, I think you've really helped shed some light on what is, I think, an often overlooked aspect of workplace inclusion practices and the impact of integrating even small changes in our hiring practices and retention strategies for greater inclusion overall can clearly have a massive ripple effect on an entire community of people, not to mention that businesses are better off for it. And so on that note, I'm thrilled to pass this over to Wendy, who's going to introduce a guest speaker who will share their experience of integrating these practices into their workplace. So over to you, Wendy.
Awesome. Thanks, Trina. What I shared with Robert Half when we were prepping for this is we can say everything we want to say, but people are really more interested in hearing from those who are walking the talk and doing this. So it's really my pleasure to introduce you to Scott Bolton. Scott is president and CEO of UFA, and he's going to provide a firsthand perspective on how inclusive hiring has impacted his organization. So we're going to use the same format, and I'm going to pose some questions to Scott, and we'll go from there. Welcome, Scott. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. So
Wendy, it's my pleasure.
Tell us, Scott, why hiring people with developmental disabilities is important to UFA.
Well, I guess I could start by saying I almost think we're beyond these sorts of questions at this stage, and in the journey to diversity. But I guess from a UFA specific perspective, we're a cooperative. We came out of the progressive movement of the last century and have an underlying belief in diversity and inclusion. It really is embedded in our DNA. In a cooperative, one member gets one vote, doesn't matter how big or small you are. So I guess if you follow the thread, you get to the reason why we believe this is important. In fact, we think it's our responsibility to give everyone in society a chance, including those with developmental disabilities. And, I think it's as simple as that.
Okay, awesome. Can you describe how having a partner, which in this case is Inclusion Alberta, yes. Little self-serving, has been important to UFA in this process?
Well, yeah, it's been, and I don't mind giving you a plug because your organization is fantastic. You've done an incredible job in helping us with this journey, because let's be honest, first off, you help find the right candidate. The candidates that are available and their skills, their strengths, and then what they are going to need to be successful, the tools that we are going to have to employ to be successful. And you also provide the necessary, support on the job to make this a success. And even in designing the job, frankly, in our case, I think that you were helpful in that regard too. And we had a certain task that we needed accomplished. And I heard, when I first jumped on, I heard the point about, this is real work, folks. This isn't charity. That's something else. This is real work. So you help design the job, find the right candidate, the fit, the support along the way. I guess you can do it yourself, and it's possible, but honest to goodness, you made it seamless. And it was the best thing we ever did was engaging your organization to help us.
Awesome, thanks. I would just like to say it's not only the design of the job description and helping with that. When Scott talks about the candidates, we pay attention to not only can they do the task, but we really pay attention to the culture of the organization and the team that the person is going to, because all of us know who have hired or hire, it's really around, is this person going to be a good fit, is as important as are they able to do, the task piece of the role. So I'll just throw that in there. Do you think UFA would have hired somebody with a developmental disability if you didn't have a partner, Scott?
Look, we certainly had a desire to do this. So I suppose if there was no organization like Inclusion available, we would have tried and possibly succeeded. But I think the truth is, no, we really did go looking for a partner to make this work. And I have, for full disclosure, a 19-year-old son of my own, a young adult, who has developmental disabilities and is entering the workforce. And so I understood from that perspective the challenges that you're going to face. You have to look at these straight in the eye. And so I think knowing what I did know, it became pretty clear that to have a support partner who really knows the game and what is involved in making this a success, it became pretty clear that we would need to use an organization. And I became acquainted with Inclusion Alberta, and the rest is history.
So what would you say has been the biggest benefit to UFA, and what would you want other employers to know?
The biggest benefit is the impact on the organization's morale, let's say, or I cannot begin to tell you how popular this was with the entire, and I mean entire organization, and we're a large organization. And it's funny, it's the very fact that it's not charity in a way that is what's important, because it is real work for real pay, and it's the very fact that it is real somehow made it more impactful and important for our employee base. And they all got behind this and got to know Jacqueline, our employee, and learned from her and the experience that we were in the journey we were all taking together, even if they were outside of the office and didn't necessarily. And this is during COVID too, so we had an additional challenge on top of it. It made us all feel like we were actually participating in this diversity journey. It was putting it to life, and we talk about it, and it's important to talk about it, but we get into almost cliches and for some people that's off-putting really. But when you see an actual example of how this can work in a real setting and becomes an employee who's part of the organization, I just can't begin to tell you that the power of it all and the impact it's had on our organization. It's one of the most popular decisions we've ever made. Full stop.
And part of the conversation we had earlier that Alf and I talked about was kind of the burden, right? That there's sometimes a perception that this takes more work, more time, more effort, more cost. Can you speak to that?
Yeah.
Was that realized for UFA?
No, it wasn't actually. Of course, look, you people with developmental disabilities have challenges that they need help with, and so providing, I guess, really the fact that we set it up for success. Maybe that's the way to put it. And you go in and communicate the requirements of the job and what is going to be involved, so that people understand that there are certain challenges that need to be overcome. But honest to goodness, it was no big deal. And it just becomes seamless. I mean, people work in different ways, and we have to learn. We all work differently. We all look different. We all have different points of view. This is just another one of those differences, right? And the other thing is, Jacqueline, some of her skill set are fantastic. I mean, her memory, her attention to detail, her ability to painstakingly get through a task. I mean, people start bringing work to Jacqueline because, those skill sets are more pronounced, and perhaps her disability helped shape those skills that others frankly don't have. I would say that has been a non-issue, and at all, frankly, in our case.
Awesome. Thank you. Before I hand it back over to Trina, Scott, do you have any kind of last thoughts that you think is important for those on the webinar to learn from you?
Well, I thought you might ask me that, so I don't want to sound preachy, right? We get preached at a lot these days, but we do have a responsibility as a society to give everyone a chance. I think that's what diversity, inclusion, belonging is all about, isn't it? And that's all we're looking for, is a chance. And I think included in that category are individuals with developmental disabilities. And when I hear the stats, and I don't know if they were talked about before, about the 80% unemployment rate, and so many young adults don't have any friends, and their abilities aren't realized, their dreams aren't realized. It is incumbent on us as leaders of organizations to make a difference on this essential issue of in our workplace. And so I would just encourage everyone on this call to do it. For us, it's the best decision I have ever made as CEO. I will tell you that full stop. I mean it sincerely, because the impact on the organization, we feel so much better about ourselves because we're putting to life what we talk about. And there's many other aspects to diversity, of course, but this is an important one. And we took the plunge, and it's worked out fabulously. And we want to do more work with you, by the way, Wendy. And I know we're trying to find the right fit. And I'll just leave it there. It's been a tremendous success for our organization. I'd encourage others to do the same. You'll have the same experience, I believe.
Yeah, and maybe just to clarify, Scott's talked about Jacqueline, which is the employee that works in the same building and office that Scott does. UFA has actually hired also in Red Deer very successfully, and that role is going really well as well.
You mentioned that as well, and that's a good point too, because we're in rural communities, and this is a problem not just in urban centers but in rural centers too. And I think we've only started that part of the journey as well, Wendy. So thank you for the reminder.
Thanks, Scott. As always, you're very articulate and passionate, and we really appreciate that. I'm going to hand it back over to Trina.
Thanks, Wendy. And thank you so much, Scott, for sharing the many ways your company has evolved through the partnership with a group like Inclusion Alberta and what it's meant for UFA. I mean, to hear you say it is the best decision that you have made as an organization, I mean, that speaks volumes. And I do absolutely agree with you that as leaders, it is our responsibility to embrace this and bring this into our organizations. And sincerely, we need more companies like yours. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. And so I think what we'll do now is we're going to move on to, I know we've got a couple of questions that are in the chat. So we're going to go to those. So the first one, I think you may have answered, Wendy, but you might want to, if there's anything you'd like to add, is from Felicia. And she said, would you recommend companies find organizations like the one you work for to address the hiring process barriers or day-to-day working experience for these individuals?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, I really do. And this isn't a slight on organizations and who you are, but I think, as Scott has really said, and I said earlier, I think a partner provides real value to organizations in doing this. And something that Alf said earlier, which is, I think, really important, is not only can a partner like us help with finding a candidate, the onboarding, determining a job description, making sure those initial on the job supports are there, but also Alf talked about career development and performance management and those pieces. And I feel, as strongly as Alf articulated it, it is absolutely critical that employees have that same experience, have the same expectations of getting their job done. But again, sometimes companies run into a bit of a bump with how to do that performance management piece for this population. That's another way that a partner can provide some really critical support and help kind of walk through that. Again, we're not going to change the process, but sometimes it's changing the language a little bit or simplifying it, or helping the supervisor understand how they can have this conversation with somebody with a developmental disability. It really isn't any different than they would with somebody else, but it's the fear of doing it wrong or not being successful, and we can provide support in that way. And the other question I saw was around working remotely. So I will tell you that if you would have asked me this question 3 years ago, I might have had a different answer than I do today. But COVID has taught us a lot, and we have had organizations hire in COVID, hire remotely, have individuals with developmental disabilities working remotely. And so is it possible? Yes, absolutely. I think maybe I'm speaking for myself. It's my own bias, but I am looking forward to getting back into the office and being with people again. And Scott talked about, the loneliness and isolation of this population. And I think one of the benefits for all of us about working is being with others. So is it possible to do it remotely and in a hybrid? Absolutely. But just like for all of us, it's the ability to kind of be together that I think, is also really important and valuable.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wendy. Certainly remote work presents different challenges. And like I think Alf said, it's just a challenge to overcome. And so regardless of the population, the other part of the question that was listed here was also, do you think from an accessibility standpoint, hybrid working options should be mandatory? Alf, I'll throw that one to you.
That's a good question. I think that our intent should always be to include accessibility and accommodation as part of the overall experience. And so whether a company decides to be fully in the office, to be fully remote, to be hybrid, I do think that regardless of whatever working setup, that accessibility does need to be kind of one of the guiding principles in that respect. And so as we think about where you're tapping in from a talent pipeline, who are the type of people, does this person require more of a hybrid working approach versus an in-person working approach? I think these are decisions that each company and each team are really going to have to make for themselves based on the work that needs to get accomplished and the way that the work can get done. I think one of the things that COVID has taught us is that there's a lot of desire and kind of this move toward this idea of remote first, hybrid, flexible first type of options. But it has also brought out the fact that some people really miss that in-person experience and believe that the in-person experience is paramount for company culture, for cohesion, for what have you in that respect. And so I think my guidance here would be, so long as accessibility and accommodation is included as part of the guiding principles, this is really where team leaders and company leaders should feel equipped to provide the right solution that is going to not only afford flexibility, but also achieve the company and team objectives as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question is, as a recruitment firm, does Robert Half have a responsibility to encourage clients to consider expanding their candidate hiring process to people with intellectual disabilities? And I would say the answer is, just in short, yes. It is our responsibility to provide our clients with a variety of different options in their hiring profiles, and to, as we're doing today, educate and create additional knowledge of the opportunities out there and to create the best possible solutions available. And so, yes, absolutely. I think Robert Half does. There's a couple of comments in here, Scott. I'm not sure if you saw them, but this has been incredible insight. Thanks, Scott, for sharing. Another said, thank you, Scott, for that wonderful story about yourself and your career. So I think Wendy hit it right on the nail in that we could talk to you all day long, but it's Scott's story that everyone is going to remember. And so I very much appreciate your time, Scott, because I think, certainly talking about doing it is one thing. It's the action that really matters. And I think your organization has shown that you put the action and you can make it work. So again, thank you so much. And so we're getting to the top of the hour, but we do have 2 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask, is there any, for Wendy, Alf, Scott, anything that you wanted to add in closing?
I think from my end, just as a reminder, different isn't bad, it's different. And so I think that's just kind of the mantra that we have to think about in order for us to create that sense of belonging and for us to try different things to be able to bring in that diverse perspective that we're looking for.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add. I think Elf said it beautifully. It is around, trying it around taking action. And if we wait until we think everything's perfect or we're not going to fail, we wouldn't do anything in any organization. So, yeah, I just know, speaking with my professional hat, I just know the impact of this on organizations. But I will tell you, speaking as a mom, I shared that I have 2 boys, and my eldest I knew was going to make his way in the world, regardless of his parents or in spite of his parents, because he doesn't have a disability. And that doesn't mean life doesn't have bumps and challenges and all of those things. But what I know for sure is for my hopes and dreams for Kyle to have a life comparable to his brothers doesn't happen without you. Blaine and I can do all we can as parents to be the best that we can be, but he doesn't have a chance unless somebody like you opens up their hearts and their doors to create an opportunity for him to be able to, demonstrate success.
So true. Scott, anything you'd like to add? As a start,
it's tough to top. I fully agree and support and applaud the comments just made, and I simply add my son Tom is entering the workforce too, and I look forward for him to have his chance to bring his skills to an employer in the near future and achieve his goals in life just like everyone else. And I'm very appreciative of your organization, Robert Half, taking this topic on. The very fact we're talking about it is the first step. So thank you.
You're welcome, and absolutely agreed. The more we talk about it, the more light we shed on it. And certainly just from an employment standpoint, 80% unemployment, when I know many, us included, organizations are struggling to find the talent that we need. There's a group of individuals there that if you can identify the right way to tap into it, it's going to give you that competitive advantage. So very much wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. I really appreciate your time. Wendy, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. Alf, thank you so much for the insights. And I'm so thrilled that you're part of Robert Half. And again, Scott, just taking the time to share your amazing story. But I just thank you for all of you also for joining, because the fact that you took time out of your day to join us says that this is a topic that's important to you, and we very much appreciate you joining us today. And so with that, I will bid you all an amazing day, and thank you again for joining. Take care.
Thank you.